The Bible in the 21st century. We're looking at various themes as taught in the Bible. In this series we're looking at end times. What does the Bible teach about end times? In this presentation we're going to be doing something slightly different. We're going to look at the evidence from the sciences related to end times. But we're going to tie this in with the biblical picture to see what light they can throw upon each other. But before we do that, let's just look back at the previous presentations in the book of Revelation. Bringing it together, the book of Revelation is not primarily a book about end times. It's a book that John wrote as a letter where he lifts the lid on what lies behind a period of intense persecution that was facing the young followers of Jesus in that part of the world. And it applies now, he says, because the time is near. But it does throw a lot of light on end times. The problem is people have used it as a kind of celestial timetable. John didn't write it for that purpose. It would have no meaning for his original hearers written in that way. It's a book to help them through intense persecution, but it does throw insights on the nature of the return of Jesus. But it can never be used as a celestial timetable. And that comes back to this mysterious 1,000 years which have led to millennialisms. The point that John was making is this: martyrdom contributes to and leads to the chaining of Satan. You can see it down through history. When people are martyred, the kingdom of God grows. Satan is changed. Eyes are opened. At the end of time, there will be a final chaining of Satan and his ultimate destruction. That sets persecution in a different context. In an amazing way, Satan is bound by persecution. And it goes back to the principle established by Jesus. The ultimate martyrdom can be seen on the cross. Now is the prince of this world brought down, said Jesus, referring to his coming execution under torture on a Roman cross. Martyrdom chains Satan. That's the point John is making. And when we start to go down speculations, we miss the key point that John is seeking to communicate to his hearers and to us today. They are simply speculations. John never mentions anywhere the return of Jesus in relation to the 1,000 years. We're missing the point. Let's go back and take what John was really saying and see its meaning in terms of end times. Heaven and earth were separated. You can see the story in the Garden of Eden. Human rebellion, we want to do it our way, breaks the bond of trust between God and us. Now it's going to be reversed, and the reversal has started when Jesus started the reversal through his crucifixion, releasing it to humankind. Now it will be completed. Now we move into resurrection living. And God's beautiful and wonderful creation, God's going to transform it and remove all that spoils and destroys it, all the ways in which we have messed it up. Transformation is central. Now with that backcloth in mind, let's move on to evidence from the sciences. We're familiar with the biblical words out at the start of our Bible. But what about the end? There isn't an equivalent at the end. Does science throw any light on what will happen at the end? What happens to time? If we look backwards, these things are well established. 13.7 thousand million years. It took that long. And in fact, we can look back at it and see why it took that long in God's plan and purpose. If we pretend this evidence, which is overwhelming, we can just ignore it and decide that the earth has a much shorter lifespan. We're living in a world of illusion. We're living in a world of delusion, and it's not what Genesis teaches. The evidence for this is completely overwhelming. But when it comes to the end of the universe, What does science say here? It can point to a number of possibilities, indeed probabilities, but it can't put times on it, and it can't say with certain what will be the end. All this problem comes back to the problem between religion and science, or sciences more accurately. This was never a problem down through the history of mankind until the mid-late 19th century, and most of the problem has been generated by Christians and latterly by Muslims. But that problem has come from there. Scientists are not running a campaign to destroy religion. In fact, if you look at the evidence, the number of Christians who are committed scientists is far higher than you'd expect from the average of the population. They are offering complementary insights, and when either science goes into religious areas or religion goes into scientific areas, we have problems. Because science is answering these kind of questions. How does the world work? And I mean a world, we're talking about the universe. The kind of questions that religion asks are quite different. Why does the universe exist? Is there a purpose for living? What is it? What happens after death? Now, science cannot throw light on answers to these questions. But equally, religion, and let's talk about the way of Jesus, Christianity, it can't throw light on understanding the world of the universe and how it works. And the danger is, and this has come from Christians particularly, is that we have gone over that borderline and we've tried to use the Bible as a scientific textbook. It isn't, and it couldn't be. Science had no meaning in those days. And we end up with all sorts of confusions. It's a sad, sad story. If you look at my series on the book of Genesis and look at presentations 5 and 6, you see how I brought it together. The Genesis story and the evidence from the sciences come together to make a beautiful and consistent whole. But we've got to understand the book of Genesis as the original author or authors designed it, not impose our Western literalistic way of thinking upon it. Biblically, that's the biblical picture, and it fits all the evidence. Human beings, God imparted spiritual life to us. We are created in His image and likeness. In some small way, we are as God is, and we do what God does. We are as God is, we are capable of love, caring for others. We have got the ability of creativity, which is the mark of God, the great Creator. I've summarized it this way. In the process of evolution, we arrived at the human level, where we've been given moral and spiritual freedom. We're spiritual beings. He imparted spiritual life to us. We're given self-consciousness. We're given the ability to create, to show love, caring that costs, not emotion. This is a new level of being. We're not just animals working by instinct. This is God's wonderful story in creation, and the science and the Bible offer complementary insights that fit together beautifully. We've got to remember this simple principle. The evidence for evolution is utterly and completely overwhelming. Indeed, you can see it today in the evolution of the virus that we call COVID-19. But it's not an explanation, because science is not in that business. It's a brilliant mechanism that God created to allow life to happen and survive, and it's easy to show that without evolution, life as we know it could not happen, and it could not survive. Absolutely brilliant. But we're not just animals, we're spiritual beings, because God has inbuilt a spiritual and a moral capacity into us. We sometimes deny it, we sometimes abuse it, we sometimes go wrong, but it's there. That's the way God made us. And the Bible gives a absolutely brilliant picture of that. It's God's wonderful story in creation, and it all comes together as a cohesive whole. But that's creation. What happens when it comes to the end? How does the Bible and science fit together here? Well, it's possible that this planet could be hit by a comet or an asteroid and life could be wiped out just like that. It's possible that we could destroy our planet by the abuse of weaponry. We could do it today, tragically. We do know that if the sun lasts long enough and it follows the pattern of other stars, eventually we will be absorbed by our sun when it becomes a white dwarf. We do know that eventually there'll be a kind of heat death of the universe. All the pointers of what's happening out there in space point to these possible directions. How does that fit? People have postulated the idea of multiple universes coexisting together. Is there a spiritual universe coexisting with multiple physical universes? Raises interesting questions. Astronomers have observed the way that stars have collapsed and rebuilt and recreated new stars, and then planets have developed. Will this be part of the process at the end? Or will something completely new and different emerge from our decaying star? Now, we don't have answers to these. They're all possibilities. They're based on good evidence, but they're all possibilities. But what do we mean by end times? There's something more that goes beyond the sciences here. What we do know biblically is that we'll be given resurrected bodies. And if we've walked with Jesus, we'll be taken into the presence of Jesus. But what happens to this planet? What happens to our wider universe? What do we actually mean by a new heaven and a new earth? We saw previously that new means not something created fresh and a fresh start, but a kind of transformation, a quality renewal. What happens to the matter, the stuff that makes you and me, you and me? And what happens to time? What do we mean by transformation? Now, many of these questions science cannot answer at all, moved beyond the realm of observation and experimentation. But are there insights from the sciences that can throw light on possibilities? Let's just look at some of these. Overall, sort of pessimism about the universe. Disasters could happen, and they could happen at any time. Overall, the biblical picture is more optimistic. How do they fit together? It links back to the question about the purpose for the existence of the universe. Science can't throw any light on that because it's not part of its questioning of observation and experimentation. But the very existence of the universe as we know it and its sheer complexity points to a creator, and it points to the nature of that creator. There are all sorts of things here that appear to be in conflict, but are they really in conflict? Are they not addressing different questions in different ways? We've got to be cautious. When it comes to the Bible, I'm going to look at end times in kind of three directions, and then we'll see what science can throw in this. At a personal level, it speaks of eternal life. Now, that phrase is grossly misunderstood. The word eternal doesn't have the idea of endless time. It's a word of quality, not quantity. Literally, it's life of the age. You could call it life of the quality of God. We move into a new life where we experience something of life of the quality of God. Historically, Jesus entered our humanity and he brought into being the kingdom of God, where people choose to come under the rule of Jesus. And that kingdom keeps on growing and developing and will be completed at the end of time. But there's a kind of cosmic side of end times too. John pictures a new heaven and a new earth. Now remember, the word new carries the idea of quality change, not something created from nothing. It's not throwing away the old earth and starting again. It's a renewal, a transformation. But there's a kind of cosmic universal renewal because heaven and earth compass everything. That's the kind of biblical picture. We're familiar with creation. How about the new creation? The new heaven and earth? How do they differ? Some people think of a creation as something completely new in the new creation. We're going to throw away this planet. It doesn't matter what we do with it now, it's going to be destroyed. But that's not what the word new means. Not the idea it carries. It's much closer to transformation or restoration. God made a wonderful universe and a wonderful world. He did not make a mistake. He made human beings, you and me. He did not make a mistake. He's not in the business of wiping out. He's in the business of transformation. That's a strong biblical pattern. And God is at the center of that new creation and that transformation. And Jesus, in all that he achieved in his life, death, and resurrection, is central to that transformation. It's positive. It's affirmative. How about time? Think about it for a moment. We think of time as linear. There's a past, there's a present, there's a future, and they're in sequence. Can't alter it. We think of it as continuous. It doesn't stop. We wish it would, but it doesn't. And we think of it as absolute. Time is fixed. It's constant. A second is a second is a second. Now, what Einstein's research showed was that these assumptions are not true. Within the confines of our existence on the planet, they give it every appearance of being absolutely true. Set that on the bigger scale of the universe, these assumptions are not true. Time is not as simple as we think it is. Well, that helps us. Let's not be too dogmatic about thinking of time, because we're limited within time. That's the way we're created. Time is bigger than us. No problem to God, he made it. But we have difficulty understanding it. We tell the time by watching decay and aging, or growth and development. One is negative, one is positive. We like the latter, we don't like the former. But that's how we tell the time. We look at the passage of time and we see decay or aging or growth or development or some combination of them. We're living within a world we're created within time. But at the world of the universal level, it's not as simple as that. Just a few thoughts related to this. Entropy is just a kind of measure of disorder. It keeps on increasing. Any process that continues on of its own accord, disorder will increase. And even if gravity manages to pull the whole universe back again, it can be shown that entropy will still increase. But in fact, when you observe the universe, the expansion of it is still accelerating. Does that go on forever? But then what does time mean at the universe level? We also know it's increasing in complexity. We experience cause and effect. Now, there's cause and effect, then you can't go back in time. Because you could change the cause, and then you could change what's happening at the moment. And we experience the flow of time. It's the way we were built. The way God designed us to live within time. And we can distinguish past and future. In Eastern cultures, they think of time as cyclical. We think of it as linear in the West. So cyclical leads to the idea of reincarnation. But that raises a problem. Can you repeat the events of history, have a second go at life? Life is linear because of cause and effect. Got to remember that the whole idea of time is relatively modern. We take it for granted. But it wasn't always so, and in biblical days they saw time very differently. We can't assume that when we leave this planet and Jesus returns, that time ends. We don't know. Nor can we assume that time will continue on the same way in the new heaven and earth when Jesus restores completely. We don't know. Time is a bit more complicated than we thought. What about space? And I don't mean space meaning out there, I mean space meaning length, breadth and height. They seem fixed on this planet. But what Einstein has shown in his research, put that onto a bigger scale, they're not constant either. You see, neither time nor distance is as constant as we think they are. That they do follow rules, but they're not fixed. The speed of light is what's fixed, not time or distance. The more I look at this, the more I think about it, the more I say, what an amazing universe. And I don't understand most of it. That's not a problem to God, He made it. But it gives us a vision of a Creator who is so far beyond us. It's mind-blowing. So let's be very cautious when we look at end times, when we talk about time, distance. Maybe they're not quite what we think they are. But let's look about matter, the stuff that makes you and me, or makes everything what it is. Solids, liquids and gases. And that is amazingly complicated as well. If you go down to the very small particles, they're governed by the principles of probability. That blows the mind. But the principles are well established and they form and follow clear mathematical patterns. When you get down to the very small, you get what we call quantum effects. There are fixed values for things like energy. And that can cause some most amazing behavior at the very, very small level. Now, the very, very small level, if you take a teaspoonful of water, very roughly there are 600,000 million water particles in that teaspoonful of water. They are incredibly small. I can't understand that, neither probably can you. God made it. We know that mass can be converted into energy. That's the basis of nuclear energy. It's the way our sun works. And we know that particles can interact with each other, even at very large distances. There are powerful forces and weak forces, but they have a major impact on how particles behave, the particles that make up matter, that make up everything in this world, including you and me. But they follow clear principles. Then we've got chaos theory. Chaos theory that the outcomes in anything change the starting conditions very slightly, you can change the outcomes completely. That's the basis of weather forecasting, and it requires powerful computers to do the mathematics. It's highly mathematical. Blows the mind. This is God's universe. What about your memories? How are they stored in your brain? They're stored by the organization of matter at the molecular level. The patterns of organization hold the information. What happens to that on death? What happens to that when we move into a new body, in the recreation and new creation that comes when Jesus winds up life on this earth? The whole thing is much more complicated, and science has throws a lot of light in it. If you look at the raising of Lazarus, it was the same body and the same person recognized by his neighbours and friends and by his two sisters, but he'd been 4 days in the grave. That blows the mind. Does that give us a model or a pattern? What about the resurrection of Jesus? Same body, same person, recognizable. Yes, he was healed and transformed because his body had been brutalized by the whipping and the brutality of death by torture on a Roman cross. But in some ways the body behaved differently. In some ways it was the same. And it was the 3rd day after his death when he was raised. God has made a wonderful world, and resurrection is a wonderful thing. And it raises all kinds of fascinating questions for which we don't have neat answers. But God knows, and God will take us through that. But matter is not as simple as we thought. Let's just bring that together. Space, length, breadth and height are more complicated than we think. Will that be further transformed in the new heaven and new earth? I leave that as a question. It's possible. Beyond our thinking processes. We are finite, we are limited. We don't know if it's timeless after death. We do know that God does not change. We do know that God interacts with humanity within time. We live in a space-time continuum now. It's the way we've been built. It's the way God has designed it. Raises the question, what happens when we move into eternity? Do we move into a life and resurrected bodies where there's no change, no decay, but there is progress? Is that the big difference? That certainly is consistent with the biblical pattern. And what about matter? It's not as fixed as we thought. Maybe it will be transformed further. It certainly was in the physical body of Jesus after his resurrection. Possible ways forward? The one thing it does show to me is that we've got to be very cautious, and a lot less dogmatism would be helpful. Our puny minds don't understand space, time and matter. The insights from the sciences have given us wonderful understandings of some of the principles, but there's much more to be understood. God created that, and life beyond the grave, resurrected life, may be more wonderful and more amazing than we can ever understand at the moment. Resurrection itself, it involves continuity and discontinuity. If we overemphasize continuity, what about people who've been blown up in a suicide bombing episode? Are their bodies all pieced together? And what about an infant who's died prematurely? Resurrected as an infant or resurrected as the adult they would have been? We've got to be cautious. Continuity, don't overemphasize it. But equally, don't overemphasize discontinuity, because that can lead us to thinking about we leave this life and we become disembodied souls floating around in the ether. But it can also lead us to thinking that the physical world is a waste of time, it's falling apart, God will destroy it. No, God will transform it. That's the biblical picture. We need the balance of both. That's the critical thing. And the understanding has to hold both in a kind of tension. It's the way God has made us, made the universe. He is a way beyond our understanding. Other things about resurrection, it does involve space-time, length, breadth and height, and it does involve physical matter. But is there some kind of total transformation of space-time? Total transformation, the matter that makes you and me, the you and me that we are? That seems to be implied. That word transformation is perhaps the key to it all. God created a wonderful world. He did not make a mistake. God created a wonderful universe. He did not make a mistake. God created you and me. He did not make a mistake. He will transform. We've messed it up. He will transform. And that involves relationship transformation, our relationships with each other, but our relations between ourselves and God himself. Central. We retain our identity and our relationships, but the biblical emphasis is very much on in Christ, or with Jesus when he appears. That kind of transforms everything. Everlasting destiny of the new heaven and new earth. We've got to watch this. What do we mean by timelessness? Going on forever? We don't know. Probably doesn't mean that. Better to see it as a transformed concept of time, and Einstein showed that time isn't as simple as we thought. And God made it that way, and maybe there's further transformations that we do not yet understand or appreciate. Humility is a great way forward in this. Paul describes it, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. That's resurrection. Look out, watch your television screens. These things are true. Humans are frustrated. The whole creation seems frustrated. It seems purposeless, futile. People don't understand where it's going. Things have gone wrong, but we don't know quite what to do about it. It's because we push God out to the edge of our lives. When we get God back in the centre, it makes a lot more sense. But there needs to be transformation of the world around, including us. Starts with our relationships being corrupted. We make a mess of how we relate to each other. Then we mess up the world around. And it goes back to the way we've broken our relationship with God by thinking we could run our lives better without him. Humanly, we try to sort out the top two, and we forget. That's the source of the problem. Bring our lives back into line with the God who made us. Get him back into the centre of the frame of our living. Then the others begin to drop into place. At the end of time, that will be completed. The transformation, the new heaven and the new earth. God made the world. He described it as very good. He's not going to throw it away. He left us as stewards of God's creation. We have failed so much in that. But God's already at work. He's recreating people one at a time. That will be completed at the end of time within the creation, recreated, renewed, transformed. Human fixes won't sort it out. The scientific doom scenarios may or may not happen. They're not the key to it. God does it. Jesus is at the centre of it. He's working in our world today, transforming humanity and transforming our physical world as we relate to it. Yes, there's judgment, because God is going to step back into history to put things right finally and completely. But it's all a picture of transformation and renewal. That involves continuity and discontinuity. Keep them in balance. But think of transformation, renewal. That's what God's going to complete at the end of time. Think of it this way. We all live within time, and it's characterized by change and corruption. We slowly decay. We mess things up. Things change. That's how we tell the time. The transformation when Jesus returns. We will be in a place. Now, I don't know what place means. That's where science helps us. Let's not be too dogmatic about place. Length, breadth and height may have no meaning in the way we understand them today. But the place where God dwells, his kind and quality of existence, eternal life, life of the quality of God. But that will be characterized by God's changelessness and incorruption. It's a picture that Paul paints rather vividly in 1 Corinthians 15. That's the way things are going. And perhaps that's the better picture. And that seems to fit the way that science comes and evidence it throws up. Because what the sciences are showing very clearly is that a lot of the dogmatism and fixedness in our mental thinking is misplaced. God is bigger than all of that. Space, time, and matter are far more complicated than we could ever dream. God made them that way, and in the transformation that will happen when Jesus returns, maybe there's something far greater and bigger than we can ever understand or conceptualize or dream up today. The key word is transformation. That's a word that's not foreign in the scientific world. Things are being transformed all the time. It's built into the way God has made our universe. It's built into the way God has made us, but it's built into the very nature of God himself. God is love. He's in the business of transforming to make things better, more like himself. Now, with that in mind, we're going to move in the next presentation to look at a bit of history of how end times ideas have developed. And in particular, we're going to look at where Israel fits into this. Sadly, this is a story of terrible confusions which remain to us today. Let's see if we can try and sort it out with what the Bible actually teaches.